Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel entitled The Whole of Nation Response to Crises. Who's at the table? Who's in charge? Presented to you by the Institute for Defense and Business in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My name is David Litt. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Stabilization and Economic Reconstruction at IDB, and it's my privilege to host and to moderate today's program. The IDB greatly appreciates the many alumni and friends who have joined us today to discuss a vital issue regarding crisis response. For those of you new to the IDB, welcome. IDB has been serving many communities in professional education and research over the past 22 years, and I am particularly honored to be supporting those of you who are a part of this crisis response domain. After a brief introduction of the panelists, I'm going to ask each of them to share some opening remarks, and then I'll try to get them to mix it up among themselves. I also plan to get to your questions, so for those of you joining us through the Zoom conferencing registration, please use the Q&A tool, which should be right about here down in the bottom center of your screen. Hit that Q&A button and submit your questions for the whole panel or a specific panelist, and you can do that at any time, even right now. The chat function, the button is also in that same location, is also available for all participants to share your comments and observations, and we will monitor that one as well. A recording of this event will be available in the next day or so and provided to all of you who have registered. We will end our session at 4 p.m. promptly, so let's begin. The COVID-19 pandemic has evolved into a multi-dimensional crisis with many public policy aspects to it: public health, economic policy, social and economic inequality, law enforcement, and the role of the military. Many crises, domestic and international, are similarly multi-dimensional. Just take, for example, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Haiti earthquake of 2010, and the West Africa Ebola epidemic of 2013. All of these had public health aspects, and the United States military was involved in all of them, just to name two of the dimensions. Today, we're going to look at the challenge of the whole of nation response to crisis. In all major crises, domestic and international, many organizations rush to respond with their own particular expertise and assistance. Some of them, like government agencies, whether at the state level or the federal level, respond because their administration has directed it. Some respond because it's part of their mission or their reason for being, like humanitarian and faith-based NGOs. Some respond to crisis because their business operations fit the requirements of the crisis and they make a profit doing so. And keep this in mind, in most crises, the private for-profit sector provides the lion's share of the real response of delivering goods and services to an affected population, both the delivery and the distribution, but also the goods and services themselves. Organizing all of this confusion is hard, and no two crises are alike, so there's no template of one size fits all. But there are some organizing principles and some structures, whether it's under the aegis of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, in natural disasters in the United States, or the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID's lead in disasters overseas. But in either case, mark my words, affected populations, even in international crises and places far away, look to the United States federal government for direction, guidance, and assistance. The administrations of George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, for example, issued presidential directives setting up a formal NSC-based process for handling complex contingencies. These worked as operational constructs and policy constructs to be able to figure out what we should be doing and how. But they weren't perfect, not only because these disasters are extraordinarily complex, but especially because hundreds of non-governmental actors are involved as well. And the questions of who made that decision and who's in charge anyway always dominates every crisis. Here are some of the questions that I hope our panelists will be able to answer for you today. First, Who are typically some of the major American players in disaster scenarios, both domestic and international? How are they organized today, if at all? Who is in charge? Who decides? Is there a better way to organize these operations? What past experiences guide our judgments about the whole of nation response? The IDB has assembled an experienced and knowledgeable panel of experts, and let me introduce them to you before asking for their opening statements. First, General Vince Brooks, U.S. Army retired. Vince wrapped up a distinguished 38-year career in the United States Army about 18 months ago, the beginning of last year. His final assignment was as commander of U.S. Forces Korea. I first met General Brooks when he became spokesman at U.S. Central Command shortly after 9/11. He then served on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon from 2002 to 2003, and it was then that he had responsibilities which included helping to establish the brand new Department of Homeland Security and the brand new military U.S. Northern Command. He was also lead strategic planner in the global war on terrorism. Lieutenant General Kathy Gainey, U.S. Army retired. Kathy is co-lead for the National Coalition to Support COVID-19 Frontline Responders under Operation Gratitude. She has over 35 years of federal service, including as Deputy Commander of the U.S. Transportation Command. She was also the Joint Staff Director of Logistics, the J4 for the military, and was the Director of Resources and Sustainment for Multinational Forces Iraq in 2005 and 2006, where she and I actually worked together pretty much on a daily basis when I was at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Mr. Jeff Orner is president of Arlington Ridge Consulting. He is a retired senior executive service officer and spent 35 years in federal service, assuring that America's national security missions had the facilities, the equipment, the supplies, and the logistics that they needed. He was the Chief Readiness Support Officer for the Department of Homeland Security, the J4, if you will, for DHS, and was Deputy Assistant Commandant for Engineering and Logistics at the U.S. Coast Guard. Prior to the Coast Guard, Jeff spent 24 years in leadership positions in U.S. Navy logistics. General Brooks is one of the current IDB Executive Fellows this year. Lieutenant General Gainey and Mr. Orner are both alumni of that program, and we welcome each of our panelists. General Brooks, we'll start with you in your opening remarks on the whole of nation response to crisis.
Well, thanks, David, and it's an absolute honor to be with this panel of good friends and colleagues and pros at this business. So I am delighted to be able to share some thoughts with you. I can say this, these types of events are always characterized by confusion, a little bit of challenge in terms of how people work together, and the questions that you've asked about who's in charge, what levels are we working at. In some cases, they become very broad, like this pandemic, which has affected every state and territory. Sometimes they're much more narrow. So each one of them is unique in how it begins. But the principal factor that makes any success possible is really about cooperation. And so there's a structure for responding to these things. And to the extent that we use that structure, born of multiple experiences, then maybe there's a chance for an effective response. The further away we go from that structure, the more difficult it is to get to the level of coordination and effectiveness that's necessary. So it's interesting when we talk about a whole of government, it really does require the whole of the government to come together, and really at multiple levels of government. Clearly, there's a federal role in some of these disasters, like the ongoing pandemic. There are state and local roles as well that cannot be walked past. In fact, the primacy for response is really theirs at those levels. But how did these federal agencies come rolling in and suddenly try to either take charge or to augment in such a way that doesn't eclipse the work of these other groups? I've seen this unfold in a number of places, both domestically and internationally, and had some responsibilities for this, as you highlighted, as well as some others in my career that gave me responsibility for areas that required domestic response and particularly military support to civil authorities. And you can find an alphabet soup out there of different agencies of the U.S. government that are involved in this. Department of Health and Human Services, and the most recent one, Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Northern Command, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Centers for Disease Control. We could run through a long list of these, and each one of them is important and necessary. So one of the big observations that I take from the ongoing pandemic response, and joined with previous responses, is how important it is to use that existing framework. And that is the National Response Framework. It's a really good document, and it lays out how these different agencies and different levels of government work with one another. And to the extent that that's used, we're in good shape. There's some lessons learned in this one where I think initially there was a view that this is a public health crisis. Therefore, any response will be led by the Department of Health and Human Services under its inherent authority, as opposed to declaring a Stafford Act, a national emergency response or a national major disaster response right away, and moving it into the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security, and particularly the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So that's just where I'll start. There are abundant lessons from this that I know are being applied and learned even as we speak. And we should see some improvement if we pay attention to what we've learned. So thanks very much for letting me join you.
Thanks, Vince. Kathy, over to you.
That was excellent, General Brooks. And let me endorse what he said. And so to not repeat that, let me talk about the additional parts of that. If you have a framework to start from, you can then deviate from that, but you have to start with the framework. And that allows everyone to understand roles and responsibilities, which is critical when everybody knows things need to happen, but you need to have a template by which you can start to work. And you have to practice that. You have to go through a couple of drills to see where are the rub points and to find ways to eliminate those rub points or clarify who's to do what to whom and where is the supporting role versus the lead role. In addition, if you've practiced this, you start to learn different organizations. Some you may assume, oh, I'm definitely going to have to work with that organization. Let me go meet my counterpart there. But there might be other organizations that you don't think you have to work with, but it's important to go meet your counterpart there, because that's where you can start establishing relationships that you're going to have to test and work together in the future that you don't even know about. So you have to identify where are the areas you could work together, where are the problems, what could you do to maybe identify those and to come up with solutions well before the crisis occurs. I'll stop there because we'll get into a lot of other things. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Jeff?
Excuse me. Thank you. And I'd like to, first of all, agree with and endorse what my counterparts have said. What I'd really like to lead with is when our country hits a major crisis, whether it's an earthquake or a pandemic or a major oil spill, if you have a critical role in a federal agency who's either going to be the lead or is going to have a major involvement, if that day is the first time you meet your colleagues and your counterparts in other federal agencies, you're going to fail, or at least you're going to have a response that is vastly less effective than it could be. And General Gainey really emphasized this in a way that I completely agree with. It's important to know who your colleagues are, to know their cell phone numbers, to know exactly what their authorities are, and to know exactly what their capabilities are. And it's also important to practice these things. I mean, war game is an awkward phrase to use if you're talking about something like a pandemic. but it's an appropriate construct. It's important to get together in advance and say, walk through the what if scenarios. Okay, what if we have a major hurricane? And oh, by the way, what if we have two major events at the same time? How far have we stretched our capabilities, and what would we do in those circumstances? So I think building those relationships is critical. And it's not just about knowing who your colleagues are and knowing how to contact them. It's also about going through those what if drills and then making sure everybody has the appropriate clauses in their contracts that can be exercised when needed, because that makes it fairly easy and seamless. And I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm back again, and hope that you all can hear me now. Great. Let me ask start with a question from the point at which I dropped off, which was, if you have all of these agencies responding to a crisis, they should not be meeting each other for the first time. And therefore, there is an imperative to set up exercises, practices, as General Gainey said. What has been your experience with what comes out of an exercise? And by the way, who organizes these exercises? Jeff, can we start with you on that?
Well, when you get outside the purely military realm, the exercises, frankly, are a little less formal. And unfortunately, they tend to happen a little less frequently than they do in the DoD arena. So numerous agencies and groups organize these exercises. And it's really a matter of people in leadership roles showing leadership, calling each other and saying, okay, next summer, let's get together and let's walk through these scenarios. So there's not one clean answer as to, it's not like there's an office in the federal government responsible for organizing these exercises. It's really about the people in leadership roles getting together regularly and figuring out how to do that.
And Kathy, how often should these exercises and practice sessions take place in your view?
I think they should occur for these major crises at least every 2 years, because you've got too much turbulence of people rotating between different positions, whether they're in the government sector or whether they're in the military sector. And it's important that you continually refresh either roles and responsibilities or new clarifications that need to be made that people did not even think about, where the event hadn't occurred before, but you use that something that has happened to say, you know, I think we need to add this to that. I think we need to look at a different role for you, or I think we need to give you a different authorities that you hadn't had before. So I think every 2 years, because it's a huge resource constraint on both DoD and in all of the federal government departmental agencies.
Vince, from your experiences in these kinds of exercises where there are outcomes, there are lessons learned, if you will, as we have heard recently or at least in this past several months, about exercises that the United States undertook for pandemics, to replicate a pandemic and then exercise what we're supposed to do. The results of those exercises, where does that reside? Who compiles them, and then what do they do with them so that another administration or even another state or perhaps another nation can learn from those?
Well, this is the valuable nature of training, and certainly from the culture that I grew up in, training is everything. And you want to train with enough iterations, under enough conditions, and with enough challenge and stimulus that your exercise is worse than the reality. And that's the way we habitually train, so that you throw everything at the training audience. And the bigger the training audience, the better, because people then begin to operate in a natural basis from their role, as opposed to role players who may not have the nuances of, well, remember the last time we did this, we upset the governor of Oregon, and so we're not going to move this way with governors so quickly. A role player might not be able to pick that nuance up. So to the extent that actual players are involved in this, and as Jeff has said, you know, the further away from the Department of Defense you go, which has an ingrained training culture, and further into the interagency, there's less of a likelihood to have a structured exercise, but sometimes just what some call a tabletop exercise. A group of people gathered around a table or joining a Zoom call nowadays and talking through the different considerations can yield points of, we're not ready for that. I hadn't thought of that. My goodness, I need to have someone in your headquarters. I have to designate someone and train them. Where does it go? At first, it goes into the knowledge set of any given organization. But it also goes into documents. And I think that's the important part about this. There are structures that can help us. I mentioned the National Response Framework. There's a National Incident Management System. And this system includes a training program to certify individuals at multiple levels, tribal up to federal, who might be involved in a response to a crisis. And they're certified by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And so the knowledge also gets embedded into these documents. The National Incident Management System, for example, just updated on the 28th of May, just days ago. It has been refreshed, and no doubt there's some of the lessons from the ongoing crisis incorporated into that training program. The National Response Framework was updated last November 2019, just in time for COVID to arrive, and yet there are new lessons. So it will reside in the individuals who participated, it resides in the organizational culture, and it resides in documents that codify our approach. The question is, do we open any of those or consult them when a crisis begins? And I would submit to you, there's a bad habit of reacting just in the situation as opposed to going back to the references, back to the rehearsed, and starting from there. As General Gainey talked about, if you have a plan, then you can deviate from that, and at least most of the other things are covered. So those are just some thoughts on training and how it applies.
And following on your point about training, does this training apply to other partners in the crisis response arena, such as the private sector, maybe logistics companies, or major big box companies that do provide goods and services? Or is it confined only to government agencies?
No, the best exercises will have all the natural players. So if there are major distribution companies, for example, that would want to or be called upon to provide distribution services in a localized, regional, or national crisis, they should absolutely be in the exercise. They may have their own exercise programs. And ideally, they would invite the federals and the states, state actors to come in and play in those exercises so that their lessons that they draw are realistic ones that are properly tempered by actual experience out there.
Ambassador Litt, I think FEMA, if I recall, at least when I was in Joint Staff J4, had a logistics industry rep in their crisis action team full-time, and it was a rotational position amongst different industry segments. And those would be the people that could help identify where to get resources and help the departmental agencies think out of the context that they were not familiar with. So that, I believe, may still already exist, and that's an incredible tool. Transcom does something similar by tapping into their logistics partners when a crisis hits to solicit information and advice like we used in Haiti to be able to have some of our commercial partners help go in and do some of the initial surveys of those ports before we could get the military down.
Great, and it's been my experience in watching this whole of nation tussle on the ground, especially in other countries. You mentioned Haiti, that not all of the players necessarily adhere to the rules and regulations that have been laid down, or at least some of the players have agreed to. Others decide that they don't want to play by those. And want to operate according to their own schedule and their own playbook. How do we deal with something like that? Jeff, can you tell us?
Well, you're right. In any crisis, there are players who play by the rules. There are players, organizations who say, hey, wait a minute, that's inconvenient. I don't want to do it that way. Well, sometimes deciding that the scenario you agreed to in advance isn't working in this particular situation is a good thing. But if someone decides that, that's where I get back to, it's important to have relationships with your counterparts, and not just at the Admiral, General, Senior Executive Service level, but down to the action officer level, so that when people make those decisions, they pick up the phone and there's some coordination and understanding of, hey, I'm from XYZ agency, and I think we need to deviate from the rule book here and do something different, and you can have a discussion. In the absence of those kind of relationships, again, at every level of the organization, you surprise each other, you duplicate efforts, you waste time. And that does unfortunately happen. But I hate to keep emphasizing the same point, but those relationships, and again, down to the action officer level, couldn't be more critical.
Let's shift the discussion a bit to the arena of logistics, which certainly is a common denominator between you, Jeff, and Kathy. And logistics often is a huge part of any disaster response effort, whether we're talking about an industrial disaster or a natural disaster or even a pandemic, as we saw in the Ebola example in West Africa. Let me start with a question that one of our audience has posed to tell us about how our government, the whole of government, organizes itself in terms of logistics, having developed what was called the Whole of Government Logistics Council. Kathy, can you tell us a little bit about the Logistics Council and what it did and what its benefits were?
Certainly. When I was on the Joint Staff J4, Admiral Mullen asked me who my counterparts were in all of the other governmental agencies. I said, okay, sir, I'm not positive. Let me go find out. So, make a long story short, we went and started in search of those organizations and who my counterpart was. It actually was harder to find the exact correlation than we thought. Jeff's laughing because he remembers the challenge we had. But we did actually find our counterparts in a myriad of different organizations. We also then had Haiti hit. We had, of course, crisis, but at least we had started developing relationships and learning about each other. As a result of that, after everything calmed down, we realized we really did need to have something formal. Everybody will laugh, but the lawyers wouldn't let us make formal contracts with each other. But we did finally agree to a coalition of the willing. And we got in all of the other federal and governmental agencies, and we had developed our own council that would meet once a month to identify issues and problems and start resolving them. To kick that off, we identified 5 projects that we thought we could address to then start developing those seeds of trust, something that one organization could do to help another, to really start at the action officer level, as Jeff said, developing those relationships. that was a huge success. And that was then the reason by which everybody said, hey, this is working. That does allow me to do something I couldn't do before. I definitely want to be part of this council. And we continued to grow that as time went on. And I think it still exists today. And the leadership role rotates amongst all of the members of the council.
Thanks very much. One of the observations that some of our participants in IDB programs have elucidated from their experience during various crises, domestic as well as international, is that sometimes certain functional expertise, the people who have that functional expertise understand each other a whole lot better than people with a different functional expertise. For example, we just talked about logisticians, and it was observed that logisticians from the Marine Corps will understand logisticians from a particular company much better than either of them will understand contracting officers, even within their own organization. This functional dichotomy, I would like to know, Vincent, have you experienced any of that as an obstacle to communication during a crisis between people of different functions, let's say logistics versus those who are involved in operations? Let's just go get things done.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think you've actually hit on a very important point. So we have these challenges to communication, and communication, of course, is the lubricant that makes these things successful or not, that come just from perspective of what's important to be done, the language that's used, the limitations that are associated with it, in some cases, the laws that govern the way things can be done. And there can immediately be friction. Hey, look, I don't care about all that. I just need to get this over here by tomorrow at 3 p.m. because there are people dying. So that will be the operator's view on it. And a logistician will say, the road is destroyed. The buildings have collapsed around it. There is no drop-off point. The items are going to spoil if you let them out of a refrigeration truck, et cetera, and all the realities come in, and there could be frustration that happens. It's an example of wisdom and whole of government approaches when a deliberate effort is made to hear these different perspectives and bring them together into solutions that might work. So the resourcing that's required might mean a sequencing of action that says, okay, let's get the road clearers in there first. Let's get the ability to refrigerate second. And then we take it in the day after that. In the meantime, we have immediate life support that's happening if needed inside of the area until the right delivery can occur. So it's this sequencing of the different perspectives, the different cultures, if you will, that creates an effective operation or creates a catastrophe, honestly. Things can arrive and be out of sequence. Things can arrive and create greater complexity. How do you decide to physically hand out water? I've seen that happen in a lot of countries. You land, push it out of the back of an aircraft, and suddenly you have this rush of people going into rotor wash while an aircraft is taking off, increasing physical danger to them, and now fighting over water. Thanks a lot for your help. I mean, this can happen very, very easily if it's not thought of. So securing an area, then landing the helicopter, then letting the water come out, then having a method of distribution, often touching local leaders if there's some still in place. And this can be not only foreign, but also in domestic responses. It's really important to find these structures to maintain some degree of order when you're trying to provide help and work through these cultural implications.
Thanks. Jeff, could you address, from your experience, how does one deal with different agencies who are participating in a response who just have totally different points of view? They disagree with each other about the best way to approach a particular operation or campaign. How does one deal with that?
Well, that comes back again to creating and participating in forums such as the Whole of Government Logistics Council, where it's important that you not meet these people for the first time the day after the crisis. It's very important that you all come to the table with a very clear understanding of exactly what authorities each of those agencies does and does not have, and what capabilities each of those agencies does and does not have. I mean, basically, before the crisis, you should have come to agreements, some of them formal MOAs, some of them simply agreements in principle that help guide you through those crises. And if you, in the middle of a crisis, come up with some major disagreement about how to deal with it, then those same structures can allow you to very quickly bump it up the chain of command and get a decision made, because there's no time for staff to be fighting about it.
I mentioned during my remarks that that the private sector plays an outsized role, really, in these kinds of crisis responses, where the media often pays attention to the government, what's the government doing, or whoever grabs the microphone the loudest and commands everyone's attention. But if nothing else, behind the scenes, the private sector is there in a big way. Can you talk, Kathy, can you talk from your experience of how do we draw in the private sector into the training and the exercises part, and also actually during the crisis itself, bring them into councils of decision-making on the ground without contravening any of our laws about favoritism and that sort of thing?
Sure, very good question. So I think Transcom and DLA have done that pretty successfully. You saw in Hurricane Sandy, where there were requirements to move fuel and supplies. And, you know, FEMA said, DLA, what could you do with your master contracts? Because you might be able to respond faster, being that they had already contracted for that for the Department of Defense. And so those were leveraged. Not only that, DLA went to Transcom and coordinated to get access to some of the other partners that brought in the big, huge generators and blowing system that blew the water out of the tunnels. Again, because people had worked together before, they knew of other organizations. They did that by identifying what the requirements were, calling their industry partners in a conference vehicle to say who has these capabilities and who can respond quickly to meet our needs. And then emergency contracts were put in place to support that.
Vince, in my introduction to you in your bio, I mentioned that you were there pretty much at the beginning after 9/11 to establish those new infrastructures that the government determined were important in order to deal with this new world, especially the Department of Homeland Security and also U.S. Northern Command. As you watched these new children grow up and become adults, if you will, in the world of policy implementation, what have you observed in actual emergencies? How well they have performed, or in what ways we might be able to improve their role in the taking care of crises?
Well, it has been interesting to watch the growth just over the last 12, 14 years or so. And certainly those entities, the Department of Homeland Security, the former Homeland Security Council, U.S. Northern Command, its component commands have been tested over and over and over again. And I think that's the reality of what we're going to face. We're not seeing once in a lifetime events. We're seeing every year or multiple times in a given year, massive events requiring these types of whole of nation responses, domestically and internationally. And so they've gotten significant iterations on how to do this. And as a result, there's more structure now in place for response. There's more practice, there's more institutional knowledge. At the same time, each one of these events is a new learning experience. I think, for example, in the most recent response, this decision about whether it's the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Homeland Security and its primary subunit, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Which is it right up front? One was exercised, one was not. The decision was to go with the one that was not exercised. That then caused a delay in committing the resources available to the Department of Homeland Security. Much more mature than they were several years ago, more mature than they were with Katrina response, Rita response, et cetera, et cetera. So opportunities were missed, and sometimes that's a decision about where do you begin. U.S. Northern Command, for example, has subordinate military structures and can become the lead Department of Defense entity. But what if the president has called for the United States Army Corps of Engineers and pushed it out front to respond in certain ways? That can create friction, as there was some friction here, but the leaders involved worked through it, which is always the case. But which is the lead Department of Defense entity? Eventually that began to sort itself out, and specific roles were assigned to help define that. Who has authority to activate contingency contracting? U.S. Northern Command has some authorities to do that, but at what point? And is it early enough in the process? I would submit to you it's not. What about dual status commanders who are National Guard officers who may be called to work underneath a federal authority to help coordinate federal response? When is the decision made to activate dual status commanders? In this case, there were some decisions to make joint task force commanders, separate commanders, and to not use dual status commanders. That created some friction, particularly with some of the states. So there are things that are still being learned that should go into the next exercise, and there'll be very important ones to try to capture this. The good news is having a Department of Homeland Security, having a United States Northern Command and its components creates another place for institutional knowledge to reside and for organizational adaptation to occur. For example, is everyone aligned with FEMA regions? Is that the subordinate structure of U.S. Northern Command? The answer right now is no. So how do we automatically liaise with them? Are the Federal Emergency Response Liaison Officers adequate? Is that a big enough response force when something happens? Or do you need a larger response force, a distribution of presence done differently? I think there are a lot of things that are emerging right now, and it will be valuable to see these lessons get incorporated.
Thanks, Vince. Jeff, could you carry on from there about this concept of lead agencies, especially in a domestic scenario? How is a lead agency chosen, and what is this FEMA region concept? Would a lead agency change from region to region? Let's say a particular a major earthquake, along the New Madrid Fault in the center of the United States or California, which crosses a lot of areas. Who chooses the lead agency, and how does that all work?
Well, typically, the role of the lead agency is established in law. I mean, if it's a domestic disaster, FEMA is the lead agency. And I think what the general is alluding to is FEMA's regions, the boundaries of them don't really match the regions of a lot of other agencies. We frankly work through that. That's less of a complication than you would think it is. So rarely do you have to decide the day after a major event who the lead agency should be. It's fairly well established by policy and law. There are times when there's ambiguities. There are times when a decision has to be made. but the agencies themselves tend to know their roles and tend to know that they're going to be involved in a major way, whether they're the lead or not. You know, for example, for domestic events, FEMA tends to be the lead agency. DHS does a lot of logistics, but there isn't any agency in the federal government who has the power in the marketplace that DLA has. It would have been foolish of us to try to duplicate that. It would, you know, it would have been wasteful. We didn't try to duplicate that. We had arrangements with DLA and also with GSA, because it simply makes no sense not to know who can provide exactly what. And even though they don't, those two entities don't tend to be the lead agency for domestic events, they're happy to use their capabilities to help us get where we need to go.
All right, here's a tough one for each of you. I'll finish up a little later on with something that's a little more optimistic. We've talked about these various structures, the National Response Framework, the National Incident Management System. There are some organizations overseas. The United Nations has its own response frameworks. But once in a while, as we have seen, despite all these great organizational structures, and they have rules and regulations and how things happen and who's responsible to whom, someone parachutes in from the outside and tries to override the decisions and the workings of the previously established order for whatever reason. What would you, especially someone who has no experience in disaster response, what would your recommendations be for how would one deal with that kind of interference, which may throw a very large monkey wrench into the works? We'll start with you, Kathy.
I think then you try and, depending on were they directed in or whether they jumped in. Let's just take, if they were directed to come in, the organization that knows that it should be lead has to start working with them in a collaborative manner to help guide them and give them the advice and structure that they are missing, such that, because the whole purpose is to, you know, reduce human suffering and reduce the trauma. So whatever any organization can do to become the supporting organization should do so. If the person is just trying to insert themselves with no authority, again, it's where you find a role for them, find something for them to do, but get that lead agency back in making the actions that they need to do. That would be my suggestion.
Vince, any thoughts?
Well, absolutely. I don't want to sound over-structuring here, but I think once again, this is the value of having lead agencies designated. And so there will come times where people doing the best they can with what they have will come in with their own caveats on what they will or will not do, how long they can do it. In some cases, people need to break contact and come back out, like some of the federal assets that might be committed. They're for use globally and cannot be fixed to an event. So there will always be a timeline associated with that. But the hard calls of, no, that's not the way it's going to happen. And I appreciate what you're doing, but we have to do it this way. And I want these to be the priorities. This prioritization comes in the form of what, even in the National Response Framework, is called a unity of command. Now, this is not the military sense of command, but it's the authority to make these tough decisions, to establish priorities, to sequence things, and to work through the frictions that come up. Because ultimately, we want this to happen from a collaborative basis of, hey, I've got this capability. I think you need this capability. How can I help? That's what we want to be the case. And that, I would say, largely is the case. But there are good reasons for entities and agencies to say, I can't go that far, or I have some limits on what I can do. For example, the military medical support that was committed for the COVID response was deemed to be focused on non-COVID medical support only. So that was a caveat that the Department of Defense imposed. Lots of good reasons for that, to preserve the wellness of the force so that it can be reused again. So it was logical to do that. But the reality became that in some cases, patients weren't coming and patients were manifesting things and then developed COVID. So do you have a non-COVID environment? Can you even establish such? And the decisions were made. The military can now support COVID cases. Well, these are the kinds of things that have to be worked through in the situation, and having a lead agency makes it possible to have someone who has the authority to make the tough decision. And let's not forget about what has to happen at state and local levels. It's easy to focus on the federal response, but the state and local levels are the primary responses to any crisis that happens. And who is it that decides for them, with them, what will happen inside of their state? And it has to be worked out at that level too. And this is why our operations centers that are created to bring these different layers and these different entities together become critically important on working through these types of problems.
Jeff, any thoughts on this thorny question of a decision-making gone awry?
Well, I think my two counterparts have covered it very well. What I'd like to add is people shouldn't think that just because you happen to be a senior decision maker in the quote lead federal agency, that means you can actually give orders to other federal agencies or to state and local governments. You can't. You have a lead role that's a coordination role. You still have to meet with and negotiate a whole range of issues and work through prioritization of how exactly you're going to use the assets available and what risks organizations are willing to take to support the ongoing disaster.
Thanks all. We're coming toward the end of our session today. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to give us some concluding thoughts. And one of the concepts that I hope that you can address in your concluding thoughts is the following. We've talked about how in many of these decision-making and very chaotic situations, you may find that no one really is in charge, but people have to work together. They have to find some way to be able to achieve the same goals. And one of the concepts that several of you have discussed already as a key to making this all work really well is the concept of building trust between organizations. So I would ask you in your concluding thoughts, can you talk to how you would recommend the whole of government, the private sector, the NGO community, and even other individuals who enter into this response arena, how can we build trust among ourselves so that the affected population is getting the best service possible, and the rest of us can function in a way that for the future, we can do this a whole lot better. Let me start with you, General Brooks.
Well, once again, thanks for the privilege of being a participant in this panel. Great discussion. I think we've all highlighted the importance of communication and cooperation. I do believe that those are the keys to success in this. Trust is built by having contact in advance of crisis, measuring one another at what do you have, how can you help, how can I help, and then iterating it, practicing it. And so then there's a measurement of, okay, I got you, I can trust you. There also has to be always, I think, in any complex human endeavor, an expectation of differing views and taking into account differing views and perspectives on a given problem. Who do I need to know? What do they know? How can I benefit from what they know? Does this square with what I understood? If not, how do I adapt and incorporate this new understanding? If there's that kind of a perception in the behaviors that individuals undertake and entities undertake, then I think that as humans, we can work through these types of crises. That's my approach to trying to lead any organization, and I know that that happens on the ground as these things are unfolding. But trust matters, and how you build trust is often a function of whether or not you were upright in what you were intending to do or not. And I think that we end up going from there.
General Gainey, some final thoughts from you?
Yes. Thank you again for allowing me to participate. Jumping on what General Brooks just said, the next level that you could do is to pick an organization and pick one project and say, what is it you really need help on that I might be able to help you with? And then work through that, because that will allow them to start believing that you really mean what you say, that you are actually putting yourself out there to help them resolve something. That allows them to believe that you're going to be there and you're going to do what you say when you say you're going to do it. So that would be my thought for the day.
Mr. Orner, last word to you.
Well, as usual, I think that my two counterparts have covered it very well. General Brooks mentioned trust. That's critical. In order to build that trust, you have to be working with your counterparts on an ongoing basis. General Gainey mentioned working together with agencies to solve problems. You shouldn't wait until it's a major disaster in the headlines to start establishing how we work together across the whole of government. We can indeed sit down in a room and say, okay, what problems do these agencies around the table have? Let's pick a handful of them and work through them. And maybe they are problems that don't make the headlines. But in the process of working through those together, you gain an understanding of capabilities and what each agency can do and is capable of doing. And then when you do reach the major crisis, I think it makes it easier. In the absence of that, truly, you're scrambling at a time when we don't have time for.
Well, I think we are now about out of time. I would like to add one final thought from my own experience to send you on your way. And that is another dimension that we have not talked about is that of time in response to crisis. Many of us are just really busy and trying to provide the immediate needs in food, water, and medicine. But there are also underlying issues of governance, of stresses in the society that are aggravated by these outside forces of an earthquake, a volcano, an industrial problem, or a pandemic. And as we respond, I would encourage us to think about making sure that we think about both the immediate term response together with the longer term building up of the institutions and the issues that may have aggravated the problem in the first place. Well, we're out of time now. I want to thank General Brooks, Lieutenant General Gainey, Mr. Orner, for a very enlightening conversation today. We appreciate all that you have done for us individually and collectively, and for taking some time to be with us this afternoon. To our audience, thank you for your questions and your participation. If you would like to hear more about this topic, or you have suggestions for additional programs, please let us know in the survey that each of you should be receiving in the next coming days. And follow IDB on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages, where we also welcome your ideas and feedback. Our next digital panel will be on June 25th. The subject is Post-COVID-19, How to Be Lean Without Becoming Brittle. And this is hosted jointly by the IDB President, Jim Hodge, U.S. Army retired, and National Defense Transportation Association President, Vice Admiral Andy Brown, U.S. Navy retired. Once again, a link to a recording of this webinar will be sent to each of you. Thanks very much for tuning us in, and please stay safe.